All right. Meantime, the nation reacting tonight to the president's overseas trip and a series of meetings at the G20 summit, including his much-anticipated sit-down with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Joining me now to talk about all of it, political commentator Tomi Lahren. Tomi, thanks for joining us. Your first time on Justice. We're happy to have you here. Tomi, I want to start with the meeting of Trump and Putin. Is there anything that the left-wing media can see that came out positive on that?
Well, of course not. They are too busy talking about body language, how long it lasted. And, I got to say this, what I find very disappointing from, the unloving and intolerant left is that though they seem to stand up for tolerance and for acceptance for the LGBT community, they seem to not have a problem with posting memes of President Trump and President Putin in a negative light. So that, first of all, is very disappointing. But, the leftist mainstream media, they could really care less about the positive advancements and the America First agenda and how positive this trip was. They're going to poke any hole that they can, and they, of course, chose this meeting to do it. All right. I want you to listen to something. This is Secretary of State Rex Tillerson talking about the meeting between Trump and Putin.
They had a very robust and lengthy exchange on the subject. The president pressed President Putin on more than one occasion regarding Russian involvement. President Putin denied such involvement, as I think he has in the past.
And what's interesting about that is that, the left is saying, this really wasn't Donald Trump pressing on the Russian meddling thing. But I sometimes wonder, if President Trump accuses Putin or asks him about the Russian so-called meddling, then they could go back and forth for the whole 2 hours and 15 minutes that they met. And what does he expect? Putin to confess one way or the other? They have to move on and talk about something forward. Well,
the mainstream media can't move on, and they seem to think because they're obsessed with this narrative that the American people need to be obsessed with it as well. And so they spend all of their time talking about, well, did he push him enough? They seem to want us to start aggressions with Russia because John Podesta and Debbie Wasserman Schultz couldn't protect their emails. So they seem to want to go to war with Russia over that, while the rest of the American people are thinking, why don't we get some reform done? Why don't we build a wall? Why don't we put America first?
Well, and the amazing part of it is that for all the months of the so-called collusion, I mean, nobody can come up with one iota of evidence. And did you notice, Tomi, that there's starting to be less and less talk about the Russian collusion because they're going to look like fools at the end, although, who knows what Mueller and his Trump-hating team are going to end up doing. But finally, what do you think of the fact that, according to those who were there, that Trump and Putin connected very quickly and that they had positive chemistry?
I think that's fantastic. Anytime we can have our leader connect with a foreign leader and have a productive conversation, everyone wins in this situation. I don't know about you, but I'm not tired of winning yet. So if we can actually have a Russia restart that the last two administrations failed to do, why would anyone have an issue with that? That's what I don't understand. And, the amazing part also is that people seem to not recognize the mutual interest that we may have as it relates to Syria and the fact that they actually signed a memorandum of a de-escalation agreement in, I believe it's southwest Syria, with the United States, Russia, and Jordan. I mean, all that is extremely positive. And when you think about, Obama dancing with the devil in Tehran as they yell death to America, it seems kind of hypocritical, wouldn't you say? Well, of course, but they are still, again, bitter that Hillary didn't become president, and they think that the reason for that is because of the Russians and because of Putin. So they will not let that go, because then they would have to actually accept the results of the election and move on. They would actually have to put forth policy positions and have an agenda, but we know that that's not their favorite thing to do. So instead, they're just going to beat this dead narrative until, I don't know, 2020, when we win again. I don't know. I think that sounds good to me, though. Yeah, it sounds good to me as well. Now, are you in Dallas now, Tomi? I am.
Okay. So Dallas has just, recognized the 1 year, or realized, I should say, the 1 year anniversary of the shooting of 5 cops in Dallas. I mean, how do you think, as you look back on the last year, this cop hatred can be stopped going forward?
Well, I will say that the election of President Trump is a great step forward, and many of my friends here in Dallas are in law enforcement, and I tell you, having the support of the president behind them for the first time in 8 years is refreshing. But I tell you about Dallas. This city is lit blue. It's going to be lit blue for probably for many days to come, because we really rally around our law enforcement here. And, you know, it's a somber mood, but it's also uplifting and it's inspiring, because we remember what we did and how we came together to support our law enforcement. And I think that that's what's great about Dallas. And
you know what? I remember the police chief. I was so impressed with the Dallas police chief. Anyway, Tomi Lahren, good to have you on. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Putin and I have been discussing various things, and I think it's going very well. We've had some very, very good talks. We're going to have a talk now, and obviously that will continue. But we look forward to a lot of very positive things happening for Russia, for the United States, and for everybody concerned. And it's an honor to be with you. Thank you. Thank you.
Finally, Rachel, proof of collusion. So this week, CNN didn't just step in it. They jumped headfirst into a sewage treatment plant and did the breaststroke. After President Trump posted this now infamous meme, CNN acted as if they were threatened by a cross between the KKK and Mothra. The crying cue ball that is Brian Stelter tried to gin up public support to throw Trump off Twitter. It was the media equivalent of ratting out an inmate in exchange for smokes from the guards. They should make a movie about him.
This is a WWE WrestleMania video. You can see that the CNN logo has been superimposed onto the other fighter's face.
He came.
Even if some people think it was just funny,
he saw.
It is being taken very seriously.
He thinked.
We're going to keep asking Twitter that question, whether they believe it violates their terms of service.
If you cross him, he'll read the terms of service. Then he'll tell on you.
Who's going to speak up?
Brian Stelter in the role of a lifetime as Captain Tattletale, with Jeff Zucker and Danny Trejo as Laser. Hall monitors, Twitter justice.
Hall monitor. Anyway, if only it ended there. CNN then launched an investigation, spending time and money going after a troll, a bad troll, but because he made fun of them. And when they found him, and who knows if they even got the right guy, they proudly paraded his scalp, but said they wouldn't name him unless he misbehaved again. Basically, they held his future in their hands. Seemed like a threat. Who does that remind you of?
What? Say what again? Say what again? I dare you. I double dare you.
That's just a joke. That wasn't real, CNN. You never know. So why is this such a big deal? Well, when a giant corporation threatens to expose a nobody in order to silence him, that's huge. It's like swatting a fly with a nuke. CNN caught hell for it, not just for being stupid, but for being creepy and humorless, too. First, the stupidity. Did they not realize the meme wasn't real? It's pro wrestling. It's fake. Sorry, Tyrus. But
Simulated combat, bro.
But once again, CNN fell for fake news. Now the humorless part, they could have laughed this thing off and moved on, but no, they lost it over this. It's not even very good. I mean, you can tell it's not really CNN. It's like, it's not real. But of course, once you say something bugs you to a bunch of people on Twitter, Reddit, and 4chan, what are they going to do next? They're just going to make more of it. That's what happens when you tell people what bothers you. They step it up. Anyone with siblings knows this. It's why I tell strangers that I hate being tickled. Of course. Yeah, that's pretty creepy. Of course, the really creepy part was making that veiled threat. Now, I've been waiting for something like this to happen for years. Ever since I turned right in the 80s, conservatives were always painted as humorless. We were the shrill, tight-ass scolds. But now we've changed, and so has the left. We're now the fun people. They're the miserables. A decade ago, I coined something called the Dean Wormer theory. It's based on the Dean from Animal House. For so long, the right was Dean Wormer, unhappy, stiff, bossy. My goal was always to turn those tables, make us the merry pranksters, and the left Dean Wormer. But then the left went and did it themselves by embracing identity politics and victimhood. They became the tattletales, and we became, by default, the troublemakers. And that brings us to CNN. Once an iconic company, they're now a sad spinster who can't take a joke. It's the new world. The libs are the shouty, humorless hacks who accuse everyone of ill will. Meanwhile, who's having fun? Us! For once! We owe this to lots of people, from early icons like P.J. O'Rourke to renegades like Andrew Breitbart, and weird shows like Red Eye. You might have heard of it. But of course, you gotta owe it to Donald Trump, who didn't give a damn what people thought, and therefore made it possible for the right to do the same. We should also thank CNN, because without them, we wouldn't have something to laugh at. Let's welcome tonight's guest. She's so bright, moths flutter around her head. Former White House National Security Council staffer, Jillian Turner. He's so funny that banana peels slip on him. Actor, writer, comedian Jamie Lissow. She's so clinical, or cynical, it's clinical. Read that in reverse. Co-host of the Fox News specialist, Kat Timpf. Yeah! And a cruise ship is his bath towel. Toy. Whoa. I know, towel. What was I thinking?
I'm just big and I'm his massive sidekick.
He's tyrant. Hey. Jamie, isn't it weird to have a president who is part of the WWE?
It is weird, but this is one of those facts where when I realized today that I had not known it, I felt smarter. You know what I mean? Like when you don't know, so like I don't keep up with the Kardashians.
Yes.
I feel smarter because of it.
Who is winning in this little media war?
I'm gonna have to say CNN is making too many mistakes.
Yeah.
And I feel like Trump is winning, like especially with the 3 CNN, they had to resign.
Yes.
By the way, the headline that I read said 3 CNN journalist reporters resign due to a mishap. By the way, when you're on a job interview, that's one of the top 5 worst reasons for leaving a job.
Yes.
It says here you left your last job because of a mishap. I'll show myself out.
Yes, exactly. Involving a forklift. Jillian, did CNN overreact to Trump's tweet? And there could have been a period where they just stopped.
I think so. Especially after watching the montage that you put together this evening. What I realized, I was one of the people who was critical of the video.
Yes.
Because I was one of those, like, it's the beneath the dignity of the office kind of people, because I have no sense of humor. However, I do think that launching a subsequent investigation and, like, outing the guy and threatening him and all this, it was just too far. And I think what ends up happening is that people end up looking like sourpusses.
Exactly.
And no one wants to be a sourpuss.
No, tell me about it. I was a sourpuss for about 10 minutes, and I felt awful.
Yeah.
Exactly. You know, Kat, the troll is not a great guy.
Right.
I mean, he does. Subsequently, they found out worse things that he put up there and that he ended up apologizing for. But that doesn't matter because CNN went after this guy without knowing that.
Absolutely. Plus saying that, well, if something changes, then we can out him. So how are they approaching this? Is CNN now going to have a solo division that's just following this guy, and then they have a sensitivity team that reviews each one of his subsequent memes, and they have a different cultural council. They decide if it's offensive or not offensive. I think that maybe they should do this thing called let it go.
Yes. I let it go often, usually on the side of a highway. Hey, Tyrus.
Hey, Greg.
Don't you think the other problem to this is whether this guy was rotten or not? CNN's a billion-dollar company. They were punching down. This isn't even punching down. This is punching way, way down.
Okay, well, first of all, the biggest problem, this whole thing, is the ugly word fake.
Yeah.
Your mama. Okay? You go see a movie, you see Terminator, you say, oh, that was a great movie, but it was really fake. No, you don't. Wrestling's entertainment.
Yeah.
It's simulated combat. Call it fake. I welcome anyone who wants to test the fake theory to come down in the ring, sign a waiver, because things happen in fake world. So that's the biggest issue for me. And here's the other thing. CNN thought they were so slick and clever with their, well, isn't wrestling fake? Simulated combat, entertainment. And before the show, we have a disclaimer that says, hi, kids. These are professional entertainers who are professionally trained to do this. Please don't try this at home. So if we're pushing something fake, at least we tell you it's
Yeah, that's true. That is true. By the way, they're still not even sure this is the actual guy.
He said a cuss word.
I know he said a cuss word. We'll edit that out.
It was the way I was raised. Sorry.
Yes, but no, but they're not. They don't even know it's the real guy. They don't.
Better devote more resources. Got to beef up the hand solo division.
Exactly.
To my point, Greg, once again, they pushed another story without enough sources.
Yeah.
Because they had one guy say, I think it was this dude over there, but I don't know, so don't say his name. Got it. Run it anyways.
Do you know what kills me? We got to move on. But the media bends over backwards to explain the non-violent nature of the word jihad with this person, Linda Sarsour. They're like, oh, she didn't really mean this or really that. But then they explain how violent a fake meme is. So they flip out over a wrestling meme, but then when Linda Sarsour starts waging jihad against Trump, they're going, oh, she didn't mean that. She didn't mean it was violent. Get it right. Like, their priorities are so effing reversed. See, that's how you swear.
You know what could really be in danger?
What?
Who could really be in danger if there is a guy out there somewhere with a cube CNN.
A tragic case of mistaken identity. It was like in America's Most Wanted. The guy who played the criminal would always get arrested.
Yes.
I'm just an actor.
So if you see one,
if
you see a blockhead CNN person walking down the street,
punch him.
Don't fall victim to stereotyping.
Right in the end.
We have a few at this network.
A Fox News alert. President Trump and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, wrapping up their meeting after more than 2 hours, much longer than it was expected to go. Right now, Rex Tillerson is briefing reporters about that meeting. The biggest headline is that President Trump reportedly brought up Russian meddling in the U.S. election right off the bat. Putin flatly denies that. We're also hearing about a partial Syria ceasefire. A lot to talk about with Alex Clement, an expert on Russia, global research director as well at the Eurasia Group. I guess it should be no surprise that the two men disagree over whether or not election meddling came up.
That's certainly right. I mean, going into this meeting, Trump was in a very difficult position domestically with respect to the Russia question. If he was seen as being too nice to Russia, it would inflame the politics of the Russia investigation. But if he brought up the Russian meddling issue and really pushed it too hard, he risked delegitimizing his own election, right? So he was on this very, very sort of narrow path. It's interesting to see that the narratives from the Russian side and the American side, you know, are not totally divergent, but are starting to hit a fork in the road. We'll have to see over the next few hours what the different readouts say.
It's no surprise, obviously, that the Russians would like to meddle with the election, but so far nobody's brought forward any evidence suggesting that, you know, that they've changed votes, changed the result.
Yeah, well, of course, I think the focus is mainly on whether there was involvement in shaping voters' perceptions before they went to the urns. But of course, as you said, there's a wide divergence on what the threshold of evidence is and who believes it and who doesn't. Several intelligence agencies, as you know, think that it happened, so that's what we go on.
It has been described that this meeting is kind of a win-win for Vladimir Putin. If he comes away with nothing, he can say, well, look, Donald Trump is a weak president and he's under fire and under investigation. But if he comes away with some kind of an agreement on Syria or anything else, he says, look what I got for the Russian people.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Putin went into this in a much stronger position, again, vis-a-vis his own domestic constituency, right? If he gets something from Putin, it's, look, we made the U.S. blink. And if he doesn't, if he gets something from Trump, rather, Putin always gets something from Putin. If he gets something from Trump, it makes it look like he had the U.S. president blink. If he doesn't, Putin can always go back very easily to a familiar narrative, which is that the United States just doesn't treat Russia fairly. And that plays very well at home. So if Trump plays tough, Putin can go back to that role.
Talk about that, because I think a lot of people don't understand the manipulation of the Russian media and frankly, state control of a lot of the Russian media. Vladimir Putin, you know, based on his KGB experience, is a master at manipulating public perception, right? And what's he going to go home to his people and say about this event?
Well, as you say, I mean, the Russian government controls most of, certainly the television media, which is how most Russians get their news. It is true that Putin has played up this narrative of a Russia sort of treated unfairly by the West, but that feeling predates Putin, right? The experience of many Russians throughout the 1990s and even early 2000s was that the West had treated Russia unfairly, had encircled Russia with NATO allies, all these things. That does strike a chord with Russian people, irrespective of the fact that, of course, the government is controlling the media space. So there's a little more there than just manipulation of the media. It's a very strongly and keenly felt thing amongst many Russians.
Can the two sides, that is the U.S. and Russia, come to an agreement in Syria that would make sense? I mean, the Russians are not going to allow anything that would dethrone, in effect, Bashar al-Assad. Yeah, well, the United States has largely come around to the reality that Assad is not going to leave power. I think one of the big questions now, and there's news that there's been an agreement on what's called the de-escalation zone in southwestern Syria. The big question is, can the Iranians be brought on board with this, right? The Russians and the Americans can agree on a certain sector of de-escalation, but there's a lot of Iranian actors in Syria, both directly and indirectly through Hezbollah, that will have to be party to an agreement. The U.S. doesn't want to talk to the Iranians. They just want to talk to the Russians, and that's a dangerous proxy relationship. One of the difficulties for Putin in this discussion is Donald Trump can be unpredictable.
Extremely unpredictable. I mean, when Putin goes home, he's got two problems. One, can he believe any commitments that Trump makes? And two, how constrained is Trump really by the institution? I mean, Congress has really turned against Trump on the Russia issue. You probably know Congress is voting to legislate the executive sanctions that are currently on Russia to make it difficult for the White House to give relief in any way to Russia on sanctions.
Fascinating stuff ahead. Alex Clement from the Eurasia Group. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
How the West was won and news lost, that is the subject of tonight's Waters Words. President Trump delivered a Reagan-esque defense of Western civilization in Poland this week.
The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have the confidence in our values to defend them at any cost? Just as Poland could not be broken, I declare today for the world to hear that the West will never, ever be broken. Our values will prevail. Our people will thrive. And our civilization will triumph.
President Trump also spelled out a very substantive geopolitical and economic policy in order to pull Poland and other Eastern European nations away from their dependence on Moscow.
We are committed to securing your access to alternate sources of energy, so Poland and its neighbors are never again held hostage to a single supplier of energy.
But instead of focusing on the defense of Western civilization and policy, the American media ignored it and took partisan cheap shots.
It's tough to be leader of the free world and king of the trolls at the same time.
The first half of the speech was packed with platitudes and trite, obvious talking points.
It was a tedious speech. It needed serious editing.
President Trump also held a press conference with the Polish Prime Minister, where he was asked about the CNN wrestling video, again labeling CNN fake news, and again responding to questions about Russian interference in our election. CNN White House correspondent Jim Acosta couldn't handle it and embarrassed himself.
For the president to then go off on CNN as fake news, to me, just made this entire spectacle seem like a fake news conference. The other thing that was fake news coming from President Trump is when he said, well, I keep hearing it's 17 intelligence agencies that say Russia meddled in the election. I think it's only 3 or 4. Where does that number come from? Where is this 3 or 4 number come from? My suspicion, Chris and Poppy, is that if we go to the administration and ask them for this question, I'm not so sure we're going to get an answer. And if we do get an answer, it'll probably be off camera.
First of all, Jim, if Donald Trump called on a friendly reporter and that makes it a fake press conference, then President Obama had fake press conferences for 8 years. And second of all, the president got the number 3 or 4 from the New York Times. They corrected the fake news story that 17 intelligence agencies said Russia interfered in the election. So it's you, CNN, that's pushing fake news. Not to be outdone, CNN's Chris Cillizza tried to trivialize the president's trip by tweeting out this deceiving video, trying to make it look like the Polish First Lady snubbed President Trump, but President Duda correcting the record tweeting, contrary to some surprising reports, my wife did shake hands with Mrs. and Mr. Trump after a great visit. Let's fight fake news. And the full video clearly shows the president did shake the Polish First Lady's hand, and there was no gaffe. I don't recall Chris Cillizza mocking President Obama for bowing to the Saudi king. The mainstream media even caught pre-spinning the Trump-Putin meeting with this headline. For Russia, Trump-Putin meeting is a sure winner. Turns out, it looks like a win for Trump and America, starting with a ceasefire in Syria.
This is our first indication of the U.S. and Russia being able to work together in Syria, and as a result of that, we had a very lengthy discussion regarding other areas in Syria that we can continue to work together on.
That included areas like North Korea, Ukraine, and ISIS. And President Trump didn't let Putin go without pushing him on election hacking, which Putin denied. So the bottom line is the media is not covering the president fairly, is not covering the president fully, and continues to trivialize him and push fake news, which is why if you want to see the president covered fairly, tune in to Waters World. President Trump and Vladimir Putin meeting face-to-face in Hamburg, Germany for the first time this week. They had their highly anticipated sit-down meeting, which was the first formal conversation Vladimir Putin and a U.S. president have had in 2 years.
President Trump back in the United States, arriving within the hour from the G20 summit, where he pledged that North Korea threat will be resolved, quote, one way or the other. The president made the pledge in a meeting with China's president before Mr. Trump left for home today from the G20 summit. Joining me now to talk about the threat and the president's comments is Deputy Assistant Dr. Sebastian Gorka. Dr. Gorka, thanks so much for being with us. Look, I'm not saying anything that you don't already know, and that is that Americans are very concerned about this wackadoo nut job over in North Korea sending us a birthday present in an attempt to send over an intercontinental ballistic missile with a nuclear tip on it. What are we going to do about that?
Well, the president took the opportunity. He showed leadership again. He met at the G20 with the president of South Korea. He met with Prime Minister Abe of Japan. They sat down. They want to ratchet up the pressure. They're calling the U.S., Japan, and South Korea are going to call for a new UN Security Council resolution against the North. The president also met with Xi Jinping. They reaffirmed their commitment to denuclearize the whole peninsula. So we're taking action. Right now it's peaceful action, Judge. It's a campaign of peaceful pressure. We're going to see if it works. But if it doesn't work, there are other options. And the president has been clear. This is a grave escalation.
Has the president given up on China helping us out?
No, I think the meeting today was part and parcel of trying to get back on track, that kind of spirit that came out of the Mar-a-Lago summit, whereby China has more capacity to pressure in the non-kinetic domain its neighbor than any other nation in the world. But the president was clear. He was disappointed with what came after those commitments. Right. So we're going to give it one more try, but all the options are on the table. And look what the president signaled already, whether it's the Moab bomb in Afghanistan, whether it's the 59 cruise missiles in Syria, Syria, we understand, and this president understands, that force is always an option in statecraft.
And in fact, we just sent 2 U.S. bombers that were flying near the demilitarized zone with South Korean and Japanese jets on a training mission. That's pretty loud and clear, and I doubt that China would want Japan to have a nuclear weapon, but I can't imagine that that isn't on the table in terms of at least protecting our interests.
Well, China has looked at North Korea for decades, for more than a half-century now, as this kind of buffer between itself and other nations like South Korea. But at some point, there has to be a realization, just how much are you willing to pay for that buffer if it creates instability, if it's in flagrant disregard of numerous Security Council resolutions on weapons of mass destruction, on rocket technology, on ballistic testing. That buffer becomes a danger to China as well. And that's the message that has to be understood, and that's what the message that the president's going to be giving to everybody.
Well, without getting into this, I seem to recall that there were some cyber attacks that prevented North Korea from accomplishing some of their goals. So cyber warfare is certainly on the table as well.
If you understand how to rudder the ship of state, then you don't just talk non-kinetic, you don't just use diplomacy. That's the last 8 years. That's the empty rhetoric of leading from behind. This president, in just a scant 24 weeks, has shown the world he understands how force has to back up diplomacy. But between peace and war, as you said, there's a massive scale of other options. And we're not going to comment on live television, even with our friends, about what we do or do not do in the cyber domain, but there are lots of tools. We are a hyperpower, Judge. We're not a superpower, we are a hyperpower, and we have lots of things we can do, covert and otherwise.
And you know, when I interviewed General Kelly about a month ago, he said that there is no doubt in his mind that within the first 4 years of the Trump administration, that Kim Jong-un will have the capacity, if he's not already in a position of having that capacity.
Look, the point is, this president is not a president you want to test. This isn't a man who's apologetic for who we are. Look at the Warsaw speech. Look at what he stands for. We are reinvigorating America. And that means standing up for our values, and it means protecting our friends and our partners. And it's a very, very bad idea to test Donald J. Trump.
Well said. Dr. Sebastian Gorka, thanks so much for joining us again tonight.
Thanks, Judge.
Meanwhile, the U.S. is planning a flight test of its THAAD missile defense system, firing interceptors from Alaska. This, of course, just days after North Korea test-launched its first intercontinental ballistic missile, which experts predict could possibly hit Alaska. Well, the nuclear program of Kim Jong-un, of course, was one of the critical topics at the G20 summit, where President Trump consulted with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, among others.
We're also talking, obviously, about North Korea and the problem and menace of North Korea. And the Prime Minister is, I will say this, very, very focused on what's going on with respect to North Korea. So we will continue those discussions.
Yeah, you understand why he's focused, because those missiles in some cases have gone right over Japan. The president also, of course, pressed Chinese President Xi Jinping, saying the issue of North Korea will be solved, Mr. Trump said, one way or another. Joining us is Van Hipp, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army and Chair of the American Defense International. Van, good to see you. First of all, this new THAAD test, why is it significant?
Well, this will be the 14th one since 2006, and Eric, they've been 100% successful since then. Now, THAAD can reach an altitude of 93 miles, so it's mainly for more of the short-range or medium-range missiles. This will be a simulated test of a North Korean intermediate-range ballistic missile, and it's been very accurate, and this test will probably take place in the next couple of weeks.
Is it different, though, from the others? As you said, THAAD's usually used for short-range, intermediate range, but, you know, not an intercontinental ballistic missile. Is there a difference?
There is a difference, and you've got a system known as GMD. That's what we've got at Fort Greely, Alaska. That's a ground-based system that is designed to go up into space, and it's primarily designed for intercontinental ballistic missiles. The problem with that is it's only been successful about 55% of the time since 2010. But Eric, the last several tests, they've been spot on, and they did a simulated test against a North Korean ICBM in May, and it was 100% accurate. But, Eric, I got to say this. Thank God for the wisdom of President Ronald Reagan. Look what he had to go to. We would not even be having this discussion right now about interceptors and missile defense had we not had a president in the 1980s who had a vision to give this country a missile defense system. And I think
but he was attacked for that. I mean, remember Star Wars?
He sure was, and thank God for what he did, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. We would not even be having a capability like that, or GMD, or Patriot, or the Aegis ballistic missile defense system we have on ships.
So you're saying without the President Reagan's foresight, we'd be kind of up the creek without a paddle right now.
This president would have even fewer options, and really he's got no good options right now because the fact of the matter is prior administrations, both Republican and Democrat, kicked the can down the road on the North Korean threat. And I got to tell you, it's that ballistic missile threat combined with that nuclear capability that we've got to watch out for. And we know that the Iranians and the North Koreans both have the nuclear warhead designs of the infamous Pakistani scientist Dr. A.Q. Khan. And that's what we've got to watch for. And you can rest assured that's what they're trying to do, is to perfect, and this is a tricky part, how you get that miniaturized nuclear warhead on an ICBM. That's what they're trying to do.
But you hit something on the head just a moment ago. You talked about kicking the can down the road. If you look at the Investors Business Daily, has an editorial a couple of days ago. It said that President Clinton basically canceled the one that President George H.W. Bush had. President George W. Bush then restarted it, but then when President Obama got into office, he cut it by 13%. And then he had to, in 2013, restart it again, basically, because of the North Korean missile threat.
That's right. In 2013, he had to go back to then reinstitute President George W. Bush's plan and beef up our missile interceptors at Fort Greely and at Vandenberg. There's plenty of blame to go around, but I got to tell you, this president is leading. He's doing the right things. He's putting pressure on the Chinese. He's putting pressure on the Russians to put pressure on the Chinese. And look, the Chinese, we all know they talk out of both sides of the mouth, but they, just like Iran, are the great enablers of the North Korean regime. They helped create this mess. And I think this thing has gotten probably even beyond the control of the Chinese. But Eric, they've got the best intel, if anyone does, of what's going on inside the Hermit Kingdom.
Yeah, but how do you know what's going on inside of Kim Jong-un's mind? I mean, I'm going to read you a couple of quotes from the past when we've had these before. You know, we flew some B-1 bombers. We reported on that over near the DMZ just today. This is what they said in June. The U.S. imperialists committed a grave military provocation by letting a formation of infamous B-1B nuclear bombers fly over South Korea once again to stage a nuclear bomb-dropping drill. The gangster-like U.S. imperialists are making all the more desperate in their moves to ignite a nuclear war despite the repeated warnings of the DPRK. Here's something else they've said about us. If the American imperialists provoke us a bit, we will not hesitate to slap them in the face, well, I didn't say face, just slap them, with a preemptive nuclear strike. The United States must choose. It is up to you whether the nation called the United States exists on this planet or not. So how do you deal? Is it even possible to negotiate and sit down when they've scuttled deals in the past with this type of rhetoric? Or is it just rhetoric?
Well, to say that Kim Jong-un has some mental health challenges is an understatement. And I think the Chinese are even beginning to realize this. Go back just a couple of months ago, he was trashing the Chinese. So, I mean, and those are the kinds of things I think that the Trump administration and the rest of the free world have got to convince the Chinese of, that this guy's a madman. You can't even control him. Help us to have regime change and stop the nuclear program they've got. And it's all about stopping and never getting to that day when they can accommodate a nuclear warhead on an ICBM. That's what it's all about right now.
We apparently are not there yet, but the predictions are that they could be, and that's the challenge. Van Hipp, always good to see you. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday afternoon, of course. Well, it's becoming a bit of a he said between American and Russian officials on the subject of the Russian interference in our election. President Vladimir Putin today at a news conference saying that President Trump did accept his denial of Russian involvement, echoing those earlier claims by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. But Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says, not at all. The president did no such thing. Remaining oddly quiet on the subject, though, President Trump himself. He would not answer when reporters asked if Putin lied when he denied any Russian interference in the election. Perhaps the president was being diplomatic, but the contrasting conclusions are apparent.
President Trump said that he had heard President Putin's clear statements that this isn't true, and Russia didn't interfere in these elections, and that he accepts these statements.
They had a very robust and lengthy exchange on the subject. The president pressed President Putin on more than one occasion regarding Russian involvement. President Putin denied such involvement, as I think he has in the past.
So, what are the results of this meeting? Niall Stanage joins us. He's White House columnist for The Hill. Look, Niall, by all accounts, Putin lied. Just bald-faced, plain lied to the face of the President of the United States. Today, the UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, says everyone knows the Russians meddled in the election. Is the President handling this appropriately? He did not have a news conference when he left Hamburg. Is this being addressed correctly?
I think it's somewhat surprising, Eric, that the President has not come out himself on this topic, partly because it would be regarded, I think, as in his interest to counter the narrative that the Russians are putting forward on this. They're saying that he accepts their denial. We've now heard that from the Russian Foreign Minister and from Vladimir Putin himself. Secretary Rex Tillerson has been talking more broadly about the idea that President Trump pushed President Putin, but I think it is somewhat surprising that we have not heard the U.S. President make his own case here.
Well, he certainly will be asked about it at some point. Do you think he would say, yeah, believe him, or do you think he would say no? The intelligence agencies say, and others, members of Congress and the Senate, that the evidence is clear in terms of Russian interference, perhaps not collusion, but Russian interference at the very least.
The President has been slightly equivocal on that point at times, Eric, and it happened again in a news conference in Poland a few days ago. He said that he did think it was Russia, but he also cast some aspersions on the verdict of the U.S. intelligence community. So it's difficult to predict exactly where he goes on this when he's asked about it. He sort of accepts that it was Russia, but suggests there could be other nations or other actors involved in this as well. That seems to be his basic position, and I assume he would reiterate it if asked.
Well, the goal of the administration, it seems to be, at least to, as they say, not in their words, relitigate all this, and that's been criticized. Minority Leader Chuck Schumer saying, this is disgraceful that it wasn't brought up more strongly and this sort of thing. But do they have a point in terms of the broad range of global issues that face the world when you're dealing with Syria, the nuclear issue, and, of course, North Korea?
I think the administration would clearly make the case that you can't get bogged down on one issue when you're seeking cooperation or progress on a number of the other issues you've mentioned. I do think that the Democratic criticism is based in part on the idea that Russia would be happy to move on from this. They would say that this isn't like some domestic argument between a couple where you both say, well, we're both at fault, let bygones be bygones. Their argument would be the fault here is Russia's, so why would the United States say, let's move on?
What's fascinating is the interplay between the two, that the meeting went on for so long. Let me play you one soundbite of President Putin talking about basically they're ping-ponging back and forth. Here's what he said.
And it would be wrong if I revealed to you all the details of my talks with President Trump. He asked me a question, I replied. He asked following questions, I explained them. I think he was satisfied with my answers.
So there, Putin is saying they really had it back and forth. What do we know about that? Not too much, but what do we know?
It seems that that part is accurate. This meeting was originally scheduled to be approximately 30 minutes, went well over the 2-hour mark. The First Lady apparently came in on one occasion to try to wrap things up, bring them to a conclusion without success. So there clearly was a genuine discussion. We don't know every granular detail of what was said, but it seems like there was some kind of relationship established. perhaps some kind of rapport established, even when there are these tensions clearly simmering just beneath the surface.
Oh, the Wall Street Journal editorial out right now basically says there's progress over the Obama administration. This is what they say, quote, Mr. Putin concluded that Barack Obama would pose minimal resistance, and so he seized Crimea, invaded eastern Ukraine, and adopted Syria's Bashar al-Assad. He's still in all three places. We can't guess what Mr. Putin made of Donald Trump. But by raising Russian interference in the U.S. election, Mr. Trump made clear to Vlad that he'll be dealing with the president of all the American people. That sounds like a positive outcome. Do you think that is the message that the president of Russia indeed did get?
It could be. It's very difficult to read Vladimir Putin. He's a very sort of cool customer. But I do think that clearly that would be something that the United States would hope. And I do have to say, for all the talk about President Trump's purported closeness or sympathy to the Russians, he did, of course, send in missiles to Syria only a couple of months ago, which clearly puts him very strongly at odds with the Russian position.
And
in that
also,
conflict.
according to the Secretary of State, he raised the fact that there's Senate and House bills for tightening the sanctions against Russia. As a reminder to the Russian president that he's got some, quills in his, what's that term is? You got stuff ready to...
Arrows in his quiver.
In your quiver, ready to fire out. I know you'd know that. Finally, let me play one also fascinating soundbite. When the President Putin talked about the TV Trump. That's how one of the translators called it, that the person he met in person and dealt with was not like the image that the President of Russia had seen on TV. Here's what he said.
I don't know how this sounds, but the way I see Trump on TV is very different from the real person. He's absolutely straightforward. He perceives the interlocutor in an adequate manner, analyzes, and answers the questions quite quickly.
Well, that seems like they may have really established some type of rapport.
Yes, absolutely. And this is an observation that people have made about President Trump at various points, that actually behind the scenes, when the TV cameras are not there, he can be a more considered, more careful, more, frankly, sort of thoughtful or nuanced figure, sometimes, engaging in more sloganeering type performances at rallies or things like that. So not an uncommon observation from Vladimir Putin there, and one that does point to some kind of rapport.
Yeah, certainly you hope it can be better for the world, depending upon, how this goes. And we'll see how those investigations go, too. Niall Stanage, a columnist for The Hill, thank you for joining us on this Saturday afternoon.
Pleasure.
Of course.